All right, well, welcome back to our 7-week Tolkien lecture series. Welcome to the people in this room, and of course the people on Facebook. As usual, if anybody has questions, please raise your hand or submit something over the chat, and I will be happy to answer it and interrupt my presentation because it's not going to be that critical. So, last week we covered On Fairy Stories, which is Tolkien's lecture that he presented in 1939, giving his theory, as you might expect, as you learned, on fairy stories and sort of how he thinks the story operates and how it contributes to myth, and how human nature basically is fundamentally rooted in storytelling and language. So this week, I'm going to delve into something a little deeper, a little more specific. So obviously the title this week is Tolkien, Beowulf, and Christianity. As I mentioned both of the first two lectures, Tolkien was one of the foremost Beowulf scholars living at his time. He was certainly arguably the most proficient speaker and scholar of Old English during his life, very passionately about, and something that he being misrepresented and misinterpreted in much the same way that he thought that fairy stories were being misrepresented and misinterpreted. So that's what we're going to be covering today, and it's something that I think should be very interesting. So, just some basic background. Beowulf is a poem that was written anywhere from the mid-7th century AD to the late 10th century AD. No one is really sure. It is hotly contested. The date I give here is around AD 700. That is what Tolkien preferred. That's the date that he thought was the most likely time period. Basically, that puts it right at a very interesting point in the history of England and the people living in England at the time, which is that in the late 6th and mid-7th centuries is about the time that that Christianization took hold in England. So this is right at the exact time that the pagan beliefs that are sort of lost today were phased out in favor of Christianity. And so Beowulf, if you're not familiar with it, is a relatively simple tale. It's a story of heroes and a story of monsters. And as I mentioned before, Tolkien's lecture that he gave on this very topic was called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, which is a lecture he delivered in 1936, which puts it 1 year before the publication of The Hobbit and 3 years before he presented On Fairy Stories. So this is all kind of the same time, all coalesced into these few years in the mid to late 1930s. So just a brief overview of the story of Beowulf. It won't take very long because it's very simple. There's a man named Beowulf, a great hero, who hears that in Denmark there is a king named Hrothgar who has a meat hall that is constantly being attacked by a monster named Grendel. And Grendel nightly comes in and starts snatching up the men of Hrothgar's hall. And so Beowulf sails across the ocean, reaches Denmark, meets Grendel in one-on-one combat with no arms. No armament, I should say, tears off Grendel's arm. So Grendel is left without an arm. Grendel flees, goes to his mother. Grendel's mother appears, kills Hrothgar's basically chief lieutenant. Then Beowulf goes to find Grendel's mother, cuts off her head with a sword that was made by a giant, and also beheads Grendel. And that is the end of that part of the story. And then there's sort of a large jump, about 50 years in the future, in which Beowulf is returned to his homeland and is now king of the Geats. And he is ruled prosperously for decades. And a dragon appears in his land, and a thief steals a cup from the dragon's hoard, and the dragon retaliates by coming out and burning villages and slaughtering cattle and destroying crops. And so Beowulf meets the dragon in one-on-one combat and is killed. And kills the dragon and is killed simultaneously, and the story ends with Beowulf's funeral. And so that is the entire story. It's about 3,000 lines of verse long. It is not exceptionally long, but it is one of the most important Old English texts because, as I said, there is very little English mythology that exists. There's virtually none survived the Norman invasion of 1066, and so the bits and pieces that Tolkien got to see in Beowulf of the pre-Christianization of England are really all that is there. So the question that naturally arose when this poem began to be studied in about the 18th century. It did not really have any great note until around that time, is whether or not this story actually is any good, whether or not the poetry is any good, whether or not the story matters. And so from that brief synopsis, as I've given it, you might ask, what even is the story? You know, there's not much of a through line. It's sort of just 3 episodes of Beowulf's life. Not much of a story there. What on earth is the point of this story? Because it seems to be Beowulf just slaughtering monsters. And especially then, why are the monsters even there? What is the point of having monsters? What possible reason do we have to tell this story? Because it seems like there's not a whole lot of depth or meaning happening. And so this is the environment that Tolkien was in the in the first half of the 20th century, that he thought that Beowulf was not getting very much respect. It was basically being, he says, there is a judgment by critics that the heroic or tragic story on a strictly human plane is by nature superior, meaning that a story that involves monsters and heroes and these great deeds of slaying are simply not up to snuff when you compare them to basic human drama. Obviously, the early half of the 20th century, that's post-World War I, that's sort of when the realist kind of modernist literature comes out, and is very depressing and sad and dour, and is very, very, very realistic. And so this is sort of the environment in which Beowulf is being studied. And so, you kind of see here an echo of what Tolkien would later talk about on fairy stories, which is that there's simply not much point in investigating the story if it involves these elements, that these elements intrinsically are just worthless. Tolkien compares it in his lecture to Milton, saying, yet this poetic talent we are to understand has all been squandered on an unprofitable theme, as if Milton had recounted the story of Jack and the Beanstalk in noble verse. So maybe the poet is competent, and maybe the poet has stuff to say, but he's completely wasting his time in telling this ridiculous story about Beowulf and the monsters. But obviously Tolkien disagrees, and so the rest of this will be elaborating on why he disagrees. So if you remember back to last week, one of the elements of fairy story that I talked about is the idea of recovery, which is one of the 3 primary elements that Tolkien saw. We're able to come of fairy story and myth. Recovery is, as he says here, recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view, seeing things as we are or were meant to see them. And so in the world of Beowulf, then, for Tolkien, that's what's happening. If you read this story, despite how maybe childish or ridiculous it seems on the surface, you're in some way pulling back the veil. You're inhabiting a world that is different. It is tearing away the sort of grungy modern world that you have been infected with, and telling you something that is really just a modern conceit that the real world as we understand it, the world around us, is the only place that truth is found, an empirical fact. And so people who have achieved recovery are basically, in this case, seeing through the eyes of the ancients. If you can achieve Beowulfic recovery, you'd be able to see the world as the Beowulf poet saw it, maybe, and to inhabit whatever headspace he was in, and to be trying to understand the things he understood through the myth that he was telling. And so Tolkien says this, which will have some old English in it. He who wrote Haleth under Heofönum may have meant in dictionary terms heroes under heaven or mighty men upon earth, but he and his hearers were thinking of Eormengrund, the great earth ringed with Garceji, the shoreless sea beneath the sky's inaccessible roof. And so his point here is that just because the Beowulf poet says something like, okay, literally this first part of the Old English here means heroes under heaven, or people that are living on earth, these mighty men upon earth. But the context is completely different than if we say. If we say there are mighty people walking the earth, we're not thinking of the world tree here, Yggdrasil, the world tree of Nordic myth, surrounded by the great serpent and encompassed by the great sea. And so when the Beowulf poet speaks of this is the context in which he's writing. And this is the only way you can really understand it. And so to get back into this world in which the people who lived in, 700, in the place that the Beowulf poet was living, were living in this world. Of course, we understand not literally living in this world, because we know that the earth is a globe that revolves around the sun. But it's completely missing, to try to understand these words in our modern conception is to completely misunderstand the point, which is that reality, quote unquote, does not really matter. So long as the inner consistency of reality, another term that he sort of brought about in various stories, so long as the inner consistency of reality of that secondary world, of Yggdrasil and the world tree, as long as that is maintained, the truths that are contained within it, the stories that are told within it, can be understood on their own terms. And there's no need to bring in science or to bring in a sort of modernist perspective of these stories. Eorbengrund is a world of monsters. It is a world of dragons. They live in this world, even if they don't live in ours. So if we can say that maybe that the monsters are defensible on those terms, that still doesn't mean they have a necessary purpose, of course. Just because they can exist doesn't mean they should exist. And so why are they there? Why do we have monsters in the story? We could have Beowulf fight a great host of men. We could have Beowulf fight a great king. We could have him do any number of things that don't involve these fantastical creatures that seem to be superfluous and seem to be just sort of melodramatic almost. And this goes into Tolkien's idea and what has become the standard idea in Beowulf scholarship for the most part, which is that the monsters are archetypal. They're not meant to be simply monsters. Of course, obviously Beowulf is fighting the monsters. He goes and rips off Grendel's arm. He goes and cuts off Grendel's mother's head. He slays the dragon and is killed. However, that's not all that's going on. As he said in On Fairy Stories, it is not simply fairy in and of itself that is meaningful. It is the human interaction with fairy that matters. And so it's not Grendel or the dragon that matters in themselves. They only matter insofar as Beowulf is interacting with them and insofar as we are interacting with the text in which Beowulf fights them. As Seamus Heaney said, Seamus Heaney now has written, in the 90s I think is when it came out, basically what has become the standard translation of Beowulf into modern English. And he, in his introduction, says, the monsters that are faced in three archetypal sites of fear. That the locations themselves are archetypes. So this whole story is replete with archetypes. And that you are living in the mythical world if you're in Beowulf. And Tolkien says in Beowulf, Monsters and the Critics, the significance of a myth is not easily to be pinned on paper by analytical reasoning. It is at its best when it is presented by a poet who feels, rather than makes explicit, what his theme portends, who presents it incarnate in the world of history and geography as our poet has done. And so it's not even so much necessarily the poet himself is conveying a specific meaning, that the poet is sitting down and saying, I'm going to tell the story of these monsters that they will fight, and they have this meaning, this meaning, and this meaning, and Grendel represents this, and Grendel's mother represents this, and the dragon represents this, and Beowulf's struggle is concretely defined by an allegorical sort of one-to-one comparison. It's simply that contained within our mind, when we read this story, we connect to the archetypes. And in some sense, the author of the poem did the same thing. For him, the story was a product of his upbringing, a product of his culture, a product of the stories that he knew, and the environment that he was a part of. And so, when he's telling the story, he's telling it because it's meaningful to him, whether or not he fully cognizes why exactly it's effective. And so Tolkien further goes on to say, it is just because the main foes in Beowulf are inhuman that the story is larger and more significant than, say, the story of the great king's fall and war. It glimpses the cosmic and moves with the thought of all men concerning the fate of human life and efforts. It stands amid, but above, the petty wars of princes and surpasses the dates and limits of historical periods, however important. And so this is the amazing thing about myth that he also talked about fairy stories, which is that it may be true that you can tell this story as having existed at some point in the past. Maybe it's true that the Beowulf story is ultimately founded in a real King Hrothgar and a real series of characters that did do these things, or something that resembles these things at some point in the past. However, in passing into myth, it no longer needs that attachment. There's nothing, as he says here, it's a mid, but also above. It can exist in the historical past, but in some sense it exists in a mythological past that has no attachment to the actual world. And so we do not need to understand the Beowulf story through an actual literal past. And so you can say that, as I said, these characters don't need to represent anything concrete or specific, but you could see in them, you could read into them certain things. And so, for example, Grendel, and this maybe will have less of an impact if you have not read the story, but Grendel is a humanoid figure. He's a character that looks like a corrupted human being. And so therefore, he can be read as a number of things. And I'll get into this a little bit later more, but he could be simply the inner corruption of humanity, that he represents the absolute worst traits of degradation that a human can sink to, and therefore that is the appearance it takes. The dragon, Tolkien thinks, is a very potent mythological element, something that he was very attracted to throughout his life, and he said many times. He says that a dragon is a personification of malice, greed, destruction, the evil side of heroic life, and of the undiscriminating cruelty of fortune that distinguishes not good or bad, the evil aspect of all life. And so it's in the dragon that he sees, and he would later say in 1965 that the reason that he wrote dragons into his mythology that he would later write is that they represent a very human bestiality and cunning, that they have a potent feeling of those elements. And again, the Beowulf poet could very well not have even thought of that, and it doesn't matter, because it's a mythological archetype that has a resonance in the human brain, regardless of where we're from or what time we're living in. So now that monsters are sort of out of the way, of course, hopefully, there's a much more fundamental element that exists in myth. And I think this, to me, is probably the most important thing to understand about Tolkien's worldview, and I would say about myth in general. That in stories like Beowulf, good and evil simply are. They are not up for debate. There's no blurry line in between redemption for Grendel, there's no redemption for the dragon, there's no redemption for Grendel's mother. It is the duty of Beowulf in this context to slay these creatures. There's no situation in which it makes sense for Beowulf to go and talk to these creatures and try to bring them over to the good side. And Tolkien says here, at the beginning of the story and during this process, and most of all at the end, we look down as if from a visionary height upon the house of man in the valley of the world. A light starts and there is a sound of music, but the outer darkness and its hostile offspring lie ever in wait for the torches to fail and the voices to cease. Grendel is maddened by the sound of harps. And this is because in the story, Grendel comes up to slay the men of Hrothgar's meat house because he hears the sound of harps, and he despises the sound of joy. And so, in this image that he gives here, that Tolkien gives here, we have an archetypal image of goodness, of the home existing in a peaceful valley, but that the forces of darkness are a tangible, ever-present force that exists outside of it. They're not able to be negotiated with, they're simply there to destroy and to corrupt. And so, these monsters are part of that force. They are an embodiment of evil. And so the way I would put this is that, obviously, we all understand, of course, that within ourselves is where the battle of good and evil is fought. That in our own souls is where we grapple with our consciences, and that's where we have to make our decisions. That's where our free will occurs. But in the mythological plane, this is externalized. The battlefield becomes the real world, or the mythological world. It makes it tangible. It makes it externally analyzable, you might say. That we say, this division is actually Michael the Archangel dueling with Satan. This is the battle between good and evil. And of course, this is not to say that at all that there's no onus on humanity. It's that we don't just sit around and the devil comes and tempts us and then we fall, and that's how evil is made. We still make choices, but in the mythological sense, it is only in the external world of battle is fought. And that's why they take on tangible, real existences, because we know the good and bad. We know the good and bad in our hearts, and so we look at them from the outside and we say, the good is Beowulf fighting against Grendel, and this is our external understanding of good and evil. And so this, I would say, is the most pernicious attack that myth gets and that Tolkien gets, because this is probably the thing that Tolkien is most, or has been, and continues to be most attacked on. And so I would say that Tolkien, in his spirit, is following the path of Beowulf. The Beowulf poet is trying to align himself with this sort of ideal. And therefore, these fundamental problems, or these fundamental issues that people take with Beowulf, are going to be taken with Tolkien. And so obviously in Tolkien, as I'm sure you all know, the good and evil do have these external tangible realities. You know, we have the orcs, we have all these monsters, we have Sauron, we have the forces of good duking it out on the stage of Middle-earth. And so I hope I've sort of, you've got a preliminary understanding of why I think to say that is simplistic and small-minded is ridiculous. And I think I would just like to reiterate again as well that this is being written right as Tolkien is in this sort of inflection point in his life. That might be an extreme way of putting it, but this is when various releases coming out, The Hobbit has just been published, and you know, The Lord of the Rings is on its way. And so all of these ideas are what are going to get baked into The Lord of the Rings. And so I think it's critical to understand that this is where Tolkien is coming from, and that the arguments that are made by Tolkien here are very much almost a preemptive defense or explanation or apology for what he will do in The Lord of the Rings. And so this charming looking fellow is a man named Edmund Wilson, who in the mid-20th century was actually a very renowned literary critic in the United States. F. Scott Fitzgerald once called him my intellectual conscience for the past 20 years. So this man was a very respected literary critic. And his review of The Lord of the Rings was a hatchet job, you might say. He said, what we get is a simple confrontation of the forces of evil with the forces of good, the remote and alien villain with the plucky little homegrown hero. And lest you think that is a sort of pat on the head remark, he later went on to say that the reason for the popularity of The Lord of the Rings is that certain people just have a lifelong appetite for juvenile trash. So he was certainly not a fan of what Tolkien was doing, and therefore I must assume he was not a fan of Beowulf. And this is something that I think is where people get lost. And this is something that Tolkien kind of raised in on fairy stories, is that for him there is no fundamental distinction between the fairy story and the myth. That they're product of the same human desire, and that they all are a form of, you know, externalizing some kind of internal debate that we have. And so, to me, anyone making an argument like this is effectively mounting an attack on the entire history of mythology and the entire history, almost of religion in a way. And this, I would say, is horribly misguided, to put it kindly. And so, as I said, populating Tolkien's good world of good and evil, of these externalized ideas, are creatures and objects that act out the mythological drama. Of course, you have your giant spiders, you have your orcs, you have your goblins, you have, you name it, it's there. Every creature known to man. And of course, as in Beowulf, the characters are going to be generally archetypal. This is another criticism that Tolkien gets. There's characters are not complex enough, or that they're cliche, or that they're simplistic. So you have the once and future king archetype, you have your small, homegrown protagonist, as Edmund Wilson put it, who is from humble beginnings and is drawn into this huge world. You have the faithful servant, you have the great Dark Lord that is the source of evil, and so on and so on. And so people, take this and they say, well, this is because Tolkien doesn't understand what he's doing, and is poor at writing narrative, and is sort of lost in how to write characters. And I would rebut by saying that it would seem strange to me if someone were to read the Iliad and tell Homer that he's bad at writing characters because Achilles is this wonderful hero with a fatal flaw. We don't generally look at mythology that way because it's unfair and ridiculous, because the whole point of those stories is to act as archetypes and to live out the drama of the human soul on the physical battlefield of the secondary world. And so something that is I think, indicative of Tolkien's perspective on this is that a line that he uses to describe Grendel, this humanoid, is that his parody of human form becomes symbolical, explicitly of sin, or rather this mystical element, already present, implicit, and unresolved, is emphasized. And so again, you're externalizing that Grendel's an externalization of human sin, and that it's in his corrupted flesh form. You can see, it makes perfect sense, of course, that if a being is corrupted and is a representation of sin, it's not going to be physically appealing any more than it's going to be, appealing in its actions. And so what you have is a corrupt, gross, abhorrent-looking humanoid figure. But I think, you could take this line and apply it equally to orcs. That Tolkien's orcs are very much described in this way in his story, because, again, I think they serve the same function. They are a corrupt form of humanity that is, being made manifest in the physical world. And something that he says about the monsters as well in the essay is that the monsters are not an inexplicable blender of taste. They are essential, fundamentally allied to the underlying ideas of the poem, which give it its lofty tone and high seriousness. And so Tolkien wants to say, not only is it not the case that including the monsters lowers the quality of the poem and lowers its stature and reduces it to a sort of, boyhood fantasy, it actually is itself the thing that elevates it. Because once you're to raise yourself to the archetypal plane, to the mythological level, it requires these sort of fantastical elements. You cannot tell the story of Beowulf slaying a king or fighting an army on any normal terms while remaining, you can't tell that and enter the mythological plane at the same time. And so it is in fantasy that you achieve mythology through these sort of archetypal imagery. And so what I have here are a couple of I think, very fascinating looks at the way that Tolkien approached the Beowulf poet. As I said, Tolkien was very much influenced by this. And I think one of the best ways to look at that is to say, I'll read these off, and they apply almost equally to Tolkien as they do to the Beowulf poet. So this is his description of the Beowulf poet. He says that Beowulf is a work by an Englishman using a fresh, ancient, and largely traditional materials. He is using the materials, then still plentiful, preserved from a day already changing and passing, a time that has now forever vanished, swallowed in oblivion, using them for a new purpose, with a wider sweep of imagination, if with a less bitter and concentrated force. He knew much about the old days, and through his knowledge of such things as sea burial and the funeral pyre, for instance, was rich and poetical rather than accurate with the accuracy of modern archaeology, such as that is. One thing he knew clearly: those days were heathen, noble, and hopeless. And so I think you can almost hear Tolkien, his empathy sort of coming out of the Beowulf poet, that he feels the call of this kind of mythological northern spirit that the Beowulf poet is drawing on. Because for Tolkien, the Beowulf poet is living at this moment of looking back upon the pagan world. That Christianity has just arrived in England, and the Beowulf poet is looking back at the pagan world and comparing it to the Christian world and almost pining after the world that has passed away, even though it is despairing and it is heathen, noble, and hopeless, as Tolkien puts it. It is a world that has its own beauty, its own splendor, that Christianity does not possess. And so I think, like I said, these are really Tolkien bearing his soul to the world and saying, I understand who this person was, because I am this person. I am the person who lives in these stories and lives in the past and wants to convey this spirit into the modern world. And so again, I'll read another quote that sounds almost like it could be written about Lord of the Rings. Tolkien says, Beowulf is not an actual picture of historic Denmark, or Geatland, or Sweden about AD 500, but it is, if with certain minor defects, on a general view, a self-consistent picture, a construction bearing clearly the marks of design and thought. The whole must have succeeded admirably in creating in the minds of the poet's contemporaries the illusion of surveying a past, pagan but noble and fraught with a deep significance, a past that itself had depth and reached backward into a dark antiquity of sorrow. And so at the risk of belaboring a point and repeating myself, I'll just say again, this is Tolkien really expressing his love for the northern spirit, for the spirit that begat the story of Beowulf, and saying that this is the beauty of Beowulf is that it has a total consistency. It is a secondary world that is constructed and carries with it a complete picture of the world, a complete sorrowful, heathen, noble, fraught with deep significance world. However, something that I had sort of neglected here, the title of this is Tolkien, Beowulf, and Christianity, but I haven't really talked about Christianity. And obviously, as Tolkien, there's no debate that there are Christian elements in Beowulf. The debate is about when they were added. For Tolkien, the Beowulf poet, as I said, is looking back at this exact moment of Christianization on the old world. And Tolkien says that in the epic of Beowulf, a heroic age more wild and primitive than that of Greece is brought into touch with Christendom, with the Sermon on the Mount, with Catholic theology and ideas of heaven and hell. It is a poem by a learned man writing of old times, who, looking back on the heroism and sorrow, feels in them something permanent and something symbolical. And so the elements are not really that significant of Christianity, but there are enough there to make it clear that the poet, if not putting these ideas in the minds and mouths of the characters, feels them himself. Grendel is referred to as a son of Cain. The two biblical characters that are mentioned explicitly in Beowulf are Cain and Abel, and Grendel is Cain. And as I mentioned before, it is Grendel hearing the flutes and the harps of Hrothgar's hall that enrages him. And actually what's happening is that Hrothgar is ordering his minstrel to sing of creation, of the divine Judeo-Christian creation. And this is what enrages him. This son of Cain is brought to wrath by this. And so you can see sort of the blending of elements, that you have the Nordic elements that existed, who knows how far in the past. The exact identity of these characters and their origin is completely unknown. But presumably they existed at some point in the past. And Grendel was not originally a son of Cain, any more than Hrothgar was originally telling a Judeo-Christian creation story to enrage him. And so it's this early blending, that the worlds are starting to meet and starting to kiss and starting to blend and to weave a new tale, if you will. And it's not quite at the point of total merger, but it's at the starting point. And so, of course, how exactly this is working is of course completely up for debate. How could you possibly have a world where God is almost not even mentioned? This is a world that is decidedly pagan in its history, and yet is clearly Christian in its authorship. And so Tolkien says that the pagan sort of elements died a hard and slow death. He says, but the shift is not complete in Beowulf. Whatever may have been true of its period in general, its author is still concerned primarily with men on earth, rehandling in a new perspective an ancient theme, that man, each man and all their works shall die. And so this is the sort of depressing background in the mind of the Beowulf poet. But for Tolkien, what he sees is that, what the quote on the screen here says, which is that the monsters sort of mold into adversaries of God, and so begin to symbolize and ultimately become identified with the powers of evil, even while they remain, as they do still remain in Beowulf, mortal denizens of the material world, in it and of it. And so, in sort of your old stories, the monsters sort of just coexist on the earth. They're certainly a force of bad. They're a negative force that must be fought, but they're not identified with some supreme mover of evil like Satan. The good and bad exist, but it is not until the dawn of Christianity that this morph happens, where Grendel and his mother become literal servants of evil, literal servants of the devil, and so they are in this interstitial period for Tolkien where they are simultaneously of the old Nordic world existing in that frame, while at the same time slowly becoming, you might say, fallen angels. They're still existing on earth in our moral plane. They haven't transcended into the spiritual plane. They haven't become true demons, you might say, but they are becoming the adversaries of God. And so this is the merger in action. And so then we get to Tolkien. This is what I'm going to call Tolkien's pagan Christianity. And this is really the beginning of understanding how Tolkien constructs the Lord of the Rings and his mythology in general. Tolkien sees that in Beowulf, England in this beginning of Christianization, which is still languishing. You might think of the line from O Holy Night, that long lay the world in sin and error pining, that this is the state in which the world exists. And it still is lying under the tragic future that is to come, that all will die, all will fail, that there is no hope. And so there is no, in Tolkien's frame, you could ask him, there's no hope. This is not a pure fairy story in Tolkien's mind. It's not something that is going to provide you with that consolation that is possible. And so he describes that when Beowulf was written, the funeral of Beowulf moved, even when it was first written, like the echo of an ancient dirge, far off and hopeless. That even when the Beowulf poet was writing, the story was already so ancient that the coming of the funeral dirge of Beowulf to that poet's ears was still depressing and somber and a distant memory. And then perhaps one of the saddest ideas is that as the poet looks back into the past, surveying the history of kings and warriors in the old traditions, he sees that all glory, or as we might say culture or civilization, ends in night. The solution of that tragedy is not treated. And so there's not even an attempt by this culture to say, there's a good end coming. It is simply an acceptance of the fact that the world ends in despair and misery. And that there is no hope beyond what Tolkien will later call the circles of the world. And so then we get to Tolkien himself, which is, and Tolkien's own beliefs. And so this is something that is, I think, hard to grasp at first, for people first getting introduced to Tolkien's sort of theological ideas. This line here is from a review by a man named Edmund Fuller, who says, in this story there is no overt theology of religion. There is no mention of God, no one is worshipped, there are no prayers. And this is very true. The Lord of the Rings contains none of these elements. And so this is what's very interesting, is that Tolkien really is taking up the mantle of the Beowulf poet in a lot of ways. He is saying, I'm going to create a world just like the Beowulf poet did. And so he's going to imbue the Lord of the Rings with the northern spirit that he loves so much from Beowulf. But at the same time, in contrast to the Beowulf poet, I've said this line before and I'll say it again, the Lord of the Rings is of course a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. The religious element of the story is absorbed into the story and symbolism. And so this is sort of the fulfillment of what began in AD 700 or whenever the Beowulf poem was written. It's the final merging. It is sort of the perfect union of the northern spirit and of Tolkien's own philosophy, which is Catholicism. And so, this is again a line from On Fairy Stories, that the Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind, which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. And so you might see here that it is in the perfect fairy story, in Christianity, the Gospel, that Tolkien sees the total fulfillment of all story, as I said last week. He sees that it is the genuine fulfillment of all human storytelling. And so he is at this point of sort of trying to bring this all together. He's going to say, look, I love the northern spirit. It is to me a fundamentally English spirit. It is something that as English people, and of course it turns out it spread much farther than England, but as English people, as an English person, he felt so connected to this northern spirit that it was a profound influence on his way of thinking. But of course, Catholicism has now been revealed as the true religion for Tolkien. This is the true myth is Christianity. And so what is the blending? What is the perfect blending? Well, as I said, if the Gospels are fulfilling it, then the sort of point at which the merger happens for Tolkien is back in AD 700. I'll repeat this sort of passage from Andre's sort of that catastrophe, that it is the mark of a good fairy story, of the higher or more complete kind, that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by, tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art, and having a peculiar quality. And so this is Tolkien's dream, is to cure Beowulf, almost. To cure it of its, as he said, its lack of treatment, that the tragedy of the Northern Spirit, that the fall and decline of the world that ends in ruin, that has no hope, that the Gospels have promised that will be fulfilled, that there is hope. And so what began with the sort of light touching of the Northern Spirit in Beowulf and Christianity in sort of the morphing of the monsters into more mythological beings is going to be fulfilled by Tolkien, consciously or not, in The Lord of the Rings. He will bring together the Northern Spirit and Christianity and eucatastrophe in order to bring the Gospels to the Northern world, as it should have been done 1,000 years ago. And so, to hear more about that, we'll have to wait until next week. Thank you.
I always thought studying English in college was learning to talk with English style. But it has been revealed to me in my middle age that it's reading literature from the early medieval era, early antiquity. Now, what I'm intrigued with as I'm listening to you are dates, because we know that the Venerable Bede wrote the history of Britain in the 8th century. But there's no mention of the only single piece of literature from that era then. So I'm intrigued with the connection between Denmark and the British Isles. It wasn't England yet. And I'm trying to figure out how the poet came to know so much about Denmark.
Well, and that's one of the most enticing things, really, is that we don't know, of course. You know, the debate about the dating of Beowulf has been going on for forever, and that the range of dates is so wide that it is 650 to about 950 is a range of like 300 years or more of when this could have been written. And so, and of course, the tragedy is in addition to that, we don't know where. What the English mythology, to use an anachronistic term, but what the sort of British mythology that existed in that area of the world was. And so Tolkien goes under the assumption that it functionally looks a lot like sort of Icelandic and Scandinavian mythologies around it. And so that's his assumption when he goes into talking about the whole Northern Spirit. He assumes that it's the same. And so there is certainly guesswork happening, and I will not pretend that there isn't. And so it's how the Beowulf poet came to be who he was, whether or not the Christian elements were added by someone else later. There was a recent study a couple of years ago that did some kind of computational analysis to determine even what the number of authors. It was thought that maybe there were even over decades there were multiple authors sort of cobbling the story together. Tolkien always adhered to the idea that there was only one author. A newish, like I said, this computational analysis of the text determined that it was more likely that it was only one. But in terms of when the whether or not dating will ever get more accurate, probably not. It's been so long, and it's just one of the great tragedies of Tolkien's life was that England had no mythology to speak of. He wrote a story called Selic's Spell, in which he tried to reconstruct pre-Christianized English mythology, and he kind of gave it up. His original intent, actually, as someone writing mythology, was to give mythology to England in a way that it didn't have, because people associate the Arthurian legends with England. They associate, a variety of things with England that are simply not English. They're Celtic. He drew a line between British and Celtic, and obviously the Arthurian legends have a lot of French in them, and so it's a tragedy to think of the knowledge that's lost. But it also, in a way, creates this kind of mythological gap that you can fill in yourself, that kind of gives it an almost more tantalizing presence in your mind, I guess.
So like Beowulf not having the huge catastrophe or any like renewal at the end, do you think that was like symbolic of the author mourning the end of the pre-Christian era? It was like with Beowulf's death is the death of this past, and we are now moving into this new era where monsters don't exist, but also the heroes don't exist.
That's a very good question. I think it's I don't know. I'm certainly no Beowulf expert. I think it's certainly a theme that runs through. I mean, I think immediately of, and this is much later, but the Arthur legend typically ends with Bedivere, the last of the Knights of the Round Table, watching Arthur leave. In Tennyson's version of the story, which is my favorite, Arthur gets on a barge. He's met by these three maidens on this barge, and he sort of cries out in despair that the age is ending, that the myths are dying from the world, and that he's going to go forth from that place with no one and nothing, because the Round Table is destroyed, Arthur is dead, and all of this is sort of falling into ruin. And so I don't know. I mean, I think it's in the Norse mythology in general. There's sort of controversy about this as well, because Ragnarok typically is the idea of the total death of the gods. That the gods are also bound by fate. They will die. They will fight with humans, and the northern spirit is dying a good death in spite of the fact that it will mean nothing ultimately. It's the dying itself is its own reward. However, there's also potentially a later edition that sort of speaks of a rebirth of the world, that the gods sort of are reborn, and that it is not all for nothing, which certainly sounds very Christian. And I don't know how much of my ignorance is simply ignorance that we all have, not knowing sort of what's going on in English mythology at this time, and how much, some of it, I'm sure a lot of it is certainly my own ignorance of just not knowing a whole lot about the subject, but my guess would be that it's, in Tolkien's mind at least, that the funeral dirge of Beowulf is a pre-existent story that is sort of this sadness with no redemption, that it took on new poignancy for the Beowulf author when he wrote it, because it was already fading, it was already going to die, and so Christianity had kind of come in to sweep away the pagans and to bring in something happier and yet more destructive.
Well, there were three things going on simultaneously in England then. One was the introduction and acceptance of the Vulgate Bible. It took 300 or 400 years before it became uniform. The other was the evolution of governance, because the tribes were merging, and simultaneously the Jutes and the Anglos and the Saxons were coming from Denmark down to Spain. And the other, which is an area I'm intrigued with, is the adoption of law. Because as governance developed, then the law merged. Now there were three classes of people: the poets, the priests, and the law. Picture some poet saying, "I wonder how I'm going to entertain the king. I think I'll write this story." And it survived. I'm curious as to when the first, are there any autographed copies?
No, I mean, the author is completely unknown. The earliest, and I think the only surviving ancient copy is from around 1095, I think is the estimated date. And so, you know, the actual authorship, as was fairly typical of Old English poetry, the author's unknown, which goes for a lot of Middle English writings as well. There's only really one Old English author that sort of started the trend of signing stuff. That was Funeral of Beowulf. But certainly, yeah, I mean, I think it's something that I certainly am not an expert in. So I will not deign to try to guess about it. But yeah, I mean, the early copy is pretty old. It is pre-1100. It's just around the time of the Norman Conquest. So it's you know, we're not talking giant leaps of time between the copies.
So, like, what, in your personal opinion, what does it mean for Americans that don't have any ancient myths to tap into for this good-evil battle in the physical? Like, we don't have any, so what do we do?
That's a very good question. I don't know. I think you have to figure it out yourself, guys. You know, we have the American myths, of course. You know, about the sort of founding fathers and Paul Bunyan and you know, yeah, we certainly lack. Even you think about the buildings we lack. We lack buildings that are older than, you know, 400 years at the absolute most. I mean, there's probably a couple churches that are still around from then. You know, that are truly American. And so, you know, I have found myself personally just drawn to whatever personally affects me, and I think that's something that I sort of adhere to more generally speaking about religious faith. You know, broadly speaking, I think whatever is, I think there's obviously a strong correlation between your cultural heritage and what personally affects you, because obviously you're a product of some of that heritage. But I don't think you should be exclusively looking at just where you're from. And so, you know, for me, I have whatever bug that Tolkien and Lewis had about the Northern spirit. And I think, and to me, Tolkien's attempt to truly marry the Northern spirit with Christianity is profoundly affecting. And so that's for me where I go for it. You know, to go back to that well. But I would say you got to find whatever works for you.
Thank you.
Your question, Alan, reminds me of, I can't remember I think it's a Michael Pollan book on food culture, and his take is not as optimistic as yours is about this pick your own. And he says, you know, basically all over the world, people have a food culture that is about the food that is grown in that area, and it's, you know, very old. And in our country, how we live today, we don't have that kind of food culture. And so in his estimation, that's why every new fad and every new diet that comes our way, you know, half of us jump on board because we get to pick what we want to pick in terms of our food culture. And maybe there's good and bad in that, and I think truly we get to pick like a smorgasbord in our spiritual culture too, because we're not as embedded or rooted. We're frontier people, colonizing people. Anything from our friends on Facebook? This is our chance. Wow, Andrew let us have some time for questions. Well, they're saying nothing on Facebook, so I think I will bid them farewell.